Hello, I'm Hannah Donnett with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. Change is bringing you the latest environmental health science through our partnerships, calls, webinars, science serves, publications, and social media. I would like to welcome everyone to the launch, or to the next in our COVID series on Delta and reducing airborne transmission in schools. Our moderator today is Karen Wang, Director of the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. We will leave time following the presentations for a brief Q&A session. You may type in questions through the Q&A feature available on the menu bar at the top of your window at any point during the presentations. After the presentations, our moderator will read out questions for our speakers to respond to. We'll get to as many comments and questions as we can during the Q&A period. For those of you who called in on the phone, we have posted slides to accompany today's webinar on our website. You can download these by going to healthandenvironment.org. Please scroll to the bottom of the page and select today's webinar. On the webinar page is a link to the slides. Everyone on the webinar right now is muted with the exception of our moderator and our speakers. This webinar is scheduled to last for 70 minutes and is being recorded for our call and webinar archive. With that, I'll turn things over to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And hello, thanks everyone for joining us today for this important webinar on Delta and reducing airborne transmission in schools. Delta is a highly contagious SARS CoV-2 virus strain that scientists estimate is more than 2 times as contagious as previous variants. As part of a layered mitigation approach, the CDC recommends improving ventilation in schools in order to reduce the number of virus particles in the air. Today, we are lucky to have 3 excellent speakers with us who will discuss airborne transmission of SARS CoV-2 and indoor air quality in school settings. Our first speaker is Dr. Kimberly Prather. Dr. Prather is a distinguished chair in atmospheric chemistry and distinguished professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography and the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at the University of California, San Diego. Over the course of her career, Professor Prather has authored over 220 publications in a wide range of prestigious scientific journals. Professor Prather invented a technique known as aerosol time of flight mass spectrometry that allows one to directly measure for the first time the atmospheric evolution of aerosol particles. This instrument is being used in atmospheric field studies and flown through clouds worldwide to determine the major sources of atmospheric aerosols, which are impacting human health, air quality, and the climate. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Professor Prather has been extremely active in science communication related to the airborne transmission of SARS CoV-2. She has been a major spokesperson conducting thousands of media interviews that have led to the implementation of measures to protect against the spread of the virus and to end this pandemic. She has been involved as an expert helping develop a safer plan for reopening San Diego Unified School District and the UC San Diego Return to Learn program. We're very lucky to have her today. Our second speaker that I'm going to introduce right now is Dr. Dustin Poppendieck. Dr. Poppendieck received his PhD in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. He has been investigating indoor air chemistry since 2002 and has been a research engineer in the Indoor Air Quality and Ventilation Group at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Most of Dustin's efforts have involved characterizing primary emission sources and heterogeneous reactions at material surfaces. He has investigated emissions from kerosene can lamps used by nearly 1 billion people throughout the developing world, spray polyurethane foam, and non-smoldering cigarette butts. In addition, Dustin has studied the disinfection of biologically contaminated building materials using high concentrations of ozone, chlorine dioxide, hydrogen peroxide, and methyl bromide. We're very lucky to have him today as well. And our last speaker today is Jim Rosenthal, who is the chairman and chief executive officer at Air Relief Technologies, which is the parent company of Tex Air Filters, Allergy Clean Environments, and Allergy Air and more. He has over 20 years of experience in the air filtration and environmental control industries and has been active in the National Air Filtration Association, serving as its president in 2009 and 2010. He is a certified air filter specialist by NAFA. He is also president of the Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America, Texas chapter, from 1998 to 2013. He is also involved in air filter test standards and currently a voting member of the ASHRAE 52.2 committee. We are lucky to have all three speakers to talk to us today about Delta and reducing airborne transmission in schools. So with that, Dr. Kimberly Prather will be our first speaker. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you, Karen, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. And I'm going to kick it off talking about the main transmission mode of SARS CoV-2, and sort of a little bit about the path to getting here, and then I'll touch on what we can do and how we have to address the airborne transmission of SARS CoV-2. Okay, now it's doing just what I was told it would do. There we go. All right, so a big question has been, I helped San Diego Unified reopen last year, and they did it really, really well by basically knowing that this virus travels through the air, and the main way we get infected is by inhaling it. As many people know, a lot of schools, unfortunately, still are focused on wiping down surfaces. And I'll talk about how that's just not the most likely pathway. Maybe it happens a tiny bit, and we shouldn't ignore it, but we should save our energy and put a lot more effort into cleaning the air. And so I'll talk about how SARS-CoV-2, the virus that produces COVID-19, is produced, some of the challenges in controlling against it, and what we've actually done successfully, I would say, at San Diego Unified, which is a large school district, over 100,000 children. And so I'll talk about that a little bit, and just, it's been a crazy path that we've been on, but I think we have made good progress. And again, I think there's a way to do it safely. So just to give sort of the update on sort of how this virus spreads, as I say, it's through the air. I've published a number of papers on it over the last year and a half with others. It's been a real team effort to try and get the shift in focus to the air. And so the main way I think that is shown here is just when you speak, sing, yell, or just breathe, you produce aerosols. And these aerosols, you can just think about being in the room with a cigarette smoker, is what we say. The aerosols will come out and they actually float, and they can travel a lot further than 6 feet. That's a really important thing to note. And they actually can build up in a room if it's poorly ventilated, just like cigarette smoke. You also produce a few, not many, droplets when you speak. I mean, that's normally what you get when you cough and you sneeze, but this virus has found a way to sneak around the globe because it is being spread largely by people who don't have any symptoms. They're not coughing, they're not sneezing. And so, but you do produce a few droplets, big ones, and those will fall to the ground very, very quickly. And that's where the original 6 feet came from. The focus has always been very much on droplets. There, unfortunately, are still people very fixated on droplets. But what happens is these aerosols come out, droplets come out, that's how they all start, but then they dry down really, really quickly to tiny little aerosols, as I say, that float. And so the main way you get infected is by breathing the air. So distance still matters. If you're up close to somebody, the concentration is higher. But as shown here, this person over here can also inhale aerosols from long range. And the longer you're in that room, the greater the chance you'll inhale enough to become infected. So time matters as well. And Delta has made it really, really challenging because there's just so much more virus that's coming out of people that are infected. And again, they don't know it. Many of them just don't know it. So they're out circulating in the community. So basically, we pushed really hard, me and many others, including people on this call that are speaking today, we've pushed as hard as we can to try and get airborne acknowledged because it's just so important for the public to understand. And we've been told people will be afraid and will scare people, but that's just not the case. Once you understand how it's in the air, you can fix it and you can shift away from scrubbing surfaces. CDC finally in April came out and said, it's very unlikely, it's less likely to get infected. I think it's 1 in 10,000 times you touch a contaminated surface, you might get infected. It's not zero, but it's not high. And so they finally started acknowledging, as I say, not until April of 2021, that this virus travels in the air. So once again, you know it's in the air, you can start thinking about places to ideally avoid. The riskiest locations are indoors. Outdoors, there's not that much transmission. There's some, it's never zero risk, but basically the green just shows activities and sort of low occupancy on the left, high occupancy on the right. The more people you put, the greater the chance that there'll be someone that's infected or more people that are infected. And yellow is a little riskier and red is very risky. And so if you go clear down to the bottom right corner, you can see that, shouting and singing indoors in poorly ventilated space is the highest risk. So basically, again, if you're in a tight space, I tell people just don't talk. There's actually signs on elevators that say don't talk because you'll produce less just by breathing. The other thing I will say is that there doesn't have to be a person present. So if you go into the bathroom after someone who's infected has been in there, people can get infected later. The virus, nobody has to be there, but the virus could still be there. And I think that's another way this virus, there's a reason we're in a pandemic, and that is a big one, I think, is that this virus is sneaky and it will hover in the air for hours once it's released. And so again, sometimes people think, oh, there's no one here, I'll take my mask off, and they can get infected. So tighter spaces, smaller spaces, poorly ventilated places are problematic. And that's why you should be wearing a mask, even when you're vaccinated indoors. And we've never let go of that. I still mask indoors, even though I'm triply vaccinated now. Okay, the other thing I want to point out is, and this is really important for schools. So in schools, right, there's a lot of unvaccinated children that are still at very high risk, but even vaccinated people can carry a lot of virus. And that's shown here, sort of when you start the infection, unvaccinated and people with breakthrough cases can shed, we call it spew the same viral load. It goes away more quickly for people that are vaccinated. That's good. But the point is that, vaccinated people can still transmit this virus. And so, get vaccinated, they work, they're safe, but just recognize you can be a carrier. And so that is a reason why it is important to still for everybody to wear a mask, even the vaccinated people. So this is a paper, this is how I got heavily involved in this. Basically, we just wrote a perspective that showed up in Science it first came out in May of 2020. And I just sort of had been looking at sort of all the evidence. I study aerosols, I'm an atmospheric chemist, but it was clear to me how this virus was spreading. And so we just sort of stitched all the pieces together and made the case for why it's so important for both parties, for everyone to wear a mask. The most important thing a mask does is it blocks the release of the virus from ever getting in the air in the first place. And so, that is the most important form of infection control, source control. Just never let it get out. And so again, because people don't know they're sick, this is why everybody should wear the masks. But also they also protect people the wearer from inhaling it. And so, as I say, this is the main way, I would say, almost the only way that you can protect yourself indoors up close when you're up close to people. You'll hear the other speakers will talk about ways to protect when you're more distant across the room, but up close masks are pretty much what you've got. And so it's really, really important in schools, especially now that we've let all the kids go back to school and the rooms are more crowded. It's really important to keep these good masks on. And that brings me to this, which is there's so many resources, and we'll make sure and I'll make sure and share some of the links. This is the Mask Nerd on YouTube. He's gone through and tested all of these masks for adults and for kids. And so I just want to let you know that there are solutions. There's lots of options. It's gotten better and better. That's the good news. And so pick a good mask, not just any mask. This is, again, more information that's on Twitter, has tons of information, some good, some bad. This is good. This just came out on all the types of masks and and respirators, and going from sort of the simple cloth mask through a surgical mask, which you can see unless you do something to close the gaps, it's not that great, but you can fix it with braces. And then you can go up to KN94, KF94, KN95s. And anyway, I just want you to know there's a range, but there is, a reason why, there is a range, and there's, I'm seeing more and more people choosing the KF94s and the KN95s in public settings, including schools, including for kids. So The one thing I want to point out is this is the mask I see the most, which is a medical or surgical mask. It was designed to block droplets. It was not designed to block aerosols. So there's these little gaps at the cheek, and all the air and the aerosols follow out there. So you can lose, over half if you're breathing it out. It won't go through the material. It will not pass through the filter. It'll go right out the sides. And so there are tricks. This is a video you can find on YouTube, which talks about just simply how to what they call the knot and tuck method. So you can convert it to a useful mask. They're the cheapest version, and many people have them. So don't throw them away. You can actually fix them. And I just want to make a point that, there's a lot of ways to modify these masks. And you can look at, how much a cough is protected. You protect if someone coughs, how much is blocked if you breathe. And what you see is that, you can get all the way up to 100%. You can get very close to 100% by what we call filtration efficiency, which means you're not letting it out. And if you're the person inhaling, you're not inhaling it. And so again, there's ways to get really, really good efficiency even for medical masks. This shows 2-ply cloth, 3-ply cloth, 4-ply cloth, and an N95. You see the N95 is pretty much the gold standard, as long as it's fit properly to your face. Again, it's all about fit. It's also about breathability and comfort so that you're not messing with it and creating leaks. And so I just want to point out, masks are the key defense we have to protecting ourselves, and there's something we control. So it's really important to acknowledge that the virus is airborne, and why. It's because once the public understands that it's airborne, it's a very fixable problem. We just were on CBS News, Jim and I, last night, building these special filters that you'll hear about after I'm done. And it's been I don't know how else to describe it, but a tragedy that the public has been so confused and has lost trust. But I can tell you that, it is in the air and there are ways to fix it. It is such a fixable problem. We didn't have to be in this situation. People should not still continue to be getting infected. And it's happening because we haven't implemented the proper safety measures, plain and simple. So what are the safety measures? There's a lot, and we call it the Swiss cheese model. This is a diagram that was developed by Ian McKay. Basically, we call it the Swiss cheese model because no one measure is perfect. And you're going to hear about a couple of other measures today. Basically, it's like each one has a hole, like it doesn't quite work. But when you put all the pieces of cheese together, you get protection, and it blocks the virus and protects you from the virus. And so this ranges from, masks is kind of the first one, all the way to ventilation and filtration, which you'll hear more about, but there's many steps we take to protect people. It also tells you, if you know it's in the air, it tells you what not to do, which is if you're speaking in a room, don't take off your mask. Unfortunately, this is the former head of CDC. This is WHO, and this is kind of how you can visualize. This is accentuated, but the point is, if you're speaking indoors, you should have your mask on. Plexi barriers, not so good, because just think about it. If you had a plexi barrier and a smoker on the other side, it just travels over, and worse, it can get trapped in your breathing zone. So it's been shown that plexi barriers, not only do they not help, they can actually lead to more aerosol being inhaled. Keep a distance. Singing indoors, still not such a good idea, and make sure and have good ventilation, which you'll learn more about next. So the last thing I'll finish up with is just, see my time, 2 more minutes. Okay, is basically the San Diego Unified District reopening. What did we do? The big thing we did was masks required. This was last spring. So masks indoors at all times. HEPA filters put in every room. We check ventilation using CO2. You'll learn more about that in a bit. There's simple ways to increase ventilation, just opening doors and windows and bringing in more fresh air through your HVAC system and putting in the proper filtration in your HVAC system, which we recommend. Again, you'll hear more about this later, MERV 13. Standalone HEPA, it just inhales the virus instead of you. And so, we call it they're calling it now the virus vacuum. It pulls it right out of the air. Do not spray chemicals into your air. Do not use ionizers. These are just extra gizmos, I would say, that make that they end up, they cost up to 10 times more. And there's ways to check that your air is actually clean. And again, I think you'll hear more about that later today. So what about this year? We were nervous. I was nervous. And, lunch is the riskiest time. That's what I keep hearing. Kids inside eating, they take off their masks, and that's what everybody gets very nervous. Eat outdoors if you can. If you can't, then just eat with smaller numbers of people and distanced, and ideally heavily make sure you're in a space that's heavily filtered. And so basically now there is a vaccine mandate for most kids in California, at least. We also are requiring masks outdoors because this new Delta variant, not so new anymore, but it can spread outdoors. It's been shown, they call it frequent, it's close, or it's short encounters, just passing by. And so outdoors, there's more people talking about thinking they were infected outdoors, and more testing and rapid testing. Big breakthrough yesterday. There's more and more schools adding rapid testing, which is, again, that's just a whole another layer of protection. So this is what we did. We basically put particle counters for aerosols and AeroNet CO2 monitors in the rooms with lots of information to test, to make sure the air is actually clean. These are all the particle measurements that were made. We have a whole panel of them, and we move them from room to room, but it basically reduced the anxiety for everybody. And so we tested it with kids in the room, everybody in the room, activities, and you can actually measure, how safe the air actually is that you're breathing. We informed people, San Diego Unified informed people about how all this works. And again, you're going to hear more about that next. But the bottom line is that schools must be given clearer guidance on how to reduce risk. Parents are confused, administrators are confused, everyone's confused. And so, this confusion is not okay. And there are simple ways to fix the air, and you're going to learn about those next. There's the do's and the don'ts, as I've already talked about. I mean, they knew outdoors and ventilation was important back in 1918. And so we've learned all of this before. Why we're not doing it, why there's so much confusion is seriously a concern. But anyway, I think my time is up. And so I'm going to stop there, and you'll get to hear about the solutions next.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Prather. While we're waiting for our next speaker to pull up the slides, I just wanted to remind everyone, we've got some great questions coming in that you can continue putting your questions in the Q&A feature, and we'll get to them at the end of all the presentations. And we'll go ahead and pass it off to you now, Dustin.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so thank you, Karen and Hannah. Before I start, I'd just like to note that any guidance that I present today is not a recommendation or an endorsement from my employer. So, as Professor Prather mentioned, when the era of COVID-19, what we really need to do is quickly find and identify classrooms that have inadequate ventilation if we're going to try and reduce long-range transmission. And as Professor Prather noted, and CDC notes here, this COVID-19 laden particles or aerosols can build up in spaces with poor ventilation and lead to this long-range infection. So we're really focusing on trying to minimize outbreaks when we start looking at ventilation rates, CO2 monitoring for ventilation. So we'll start with ASHRAE. ASHRAE is an organization that writes consensus standards for designing of buildings, including ventilation rates. ASHRAE provides standard values in classrooms that they should be ventilated to in pre-pandemic times. I don't know why this is going so fast. However, these values don't consider infectious disease risk. Historically, the limited data available in classrooms has shown that classrooms in the United States tend to be under-ventilated in relation to those pre-pandemic ventilation standards. This is one example from 2010 work from Haver and Shaughnessy, and they found that for typical classrooms, the ASHRAE required ventilation rate for outdoor air is just about 7 liters per second. The vertical line here also corresponds to about 15 cubic feet per minute. A majority of the classrooms surveyed in this work were far below this requirement. And so our goal for CO2 monitors in classrooms is really to find these poorly ventilated rooms. We want to target these and fix them before we have outbreaks in those classrooms. So where does CO2 come from? In your lungs, you exchange oxygen in the air with carbon dioxide. And importantly, the amount of carbon dioxide that we emit depends on our sex, age, activity level, and size. The air that we breathe in is about 0.04% carbon dioxide, and the air we breathe out is about 4% carbon dioxide. So given that it's relatively high concentration and the ease of measurement compared to other chemicals in our environment, carbon dioxide is a pretty good proxy for the emissions from humans. It's important that we take a pause here and note that CO2 is not a proxy, is only a proxy for human emissions, but there are many other things that impact our indoor air quality. So CO2 does not equal indoor air quality. For instance, building materials, furniture, cleaning supplies, indoor chemical reactions, and even outdoor contaminants coming indoors can all impact the indoor air quality. Hence, if we have low CO2 concentrations, that doesn't necessarily indicate that we have good indoor air quality in general. We're only talking about CO2 in this case for the human emission aspect and how it relates to transmission of COVID-19 and other airborne diseases. So consumer grade CO2 monitors do have limitations. It's important to note these. Some cheaper monitors do not use non-dispersive infrared sensors, and these can have errors depending on what chemical they were calibrated with. And although NDIR sensors report values to 3 digits, they're typically only accurate to about 50 ppm, plus or minus 50 ppm based on their readings. Finally, these sensors can drift over time, so we have to be careful that we keep them calibrated or at least check them with outdoor air concentrations. However, the sensors are typically relatively linear, so the data difference between an indoor and outdoor concentration is typically fairly consistent for NDIR sensors. Also, when we use CO2 as a ventilation clue indoors, we want to make sure that there's not other non-human sources of CO2 present. For instance, indoor combustion or vehicles idling outside, or that we don't have huge amounts of indoor plants or other CO2 mechanisms that could reduce the CO2 concentration. So we got to make sure that we're not in a greenhouse, we don't have a school bus right outside, and we're not cooking up fajitas. So how do we use CO2 readings from a classroom to assess our ventilation? Well, there's 3 different potential approaches. The first deals with how much air we rebreathe that has previously been in somebody else's lungs, and we're going to call that the rebreathed fraction. We can use CO2 to determine the fraction of air that you're breathing that has been in somebody's lungs. For instance, if the indoor carbon dioxide concentration is 820 parts per million, or 820 carbon dioxide molecules per 1 million total molecules of the air, and the outdoor concentration is 420 ppm, when you have an typical exhaled concentration of 40,000 ppm, then your rebreathed fraction is roughly 1%, or 1% of every breath a person takes will consist of air that has been in somebody else's lungs. If we up that concentration and we go to 3,600 ppm, then 8% of every breath a person takes in that room will be in air that has been in somebody else's lungs, or roughly 8 times higher than if the average indoor concentration was only 820. For airborne viruses such as COVID-19, we really want to keep the rebreathed fraction, as indicated by the carbon dioxide concentration, as low as possible. The lower the rebreathed fraction, the lower the overall risk is if there is a COVID-19 emitter present in the room, that you're going to actually inhale COVID-19 laden aerosols. A second approach to using CO2 readings from a classroom is you can look at the maximum daily CO2 concentration when the space is used under normal occupancy. This is important that we have the normal number of kids and teachers in that classroom when we're doing this analysis. To do this, what we want to do is we want to place CO2 sensors outside for 5 minutes to make sure that they have that they're giving an accurate reading. Should be somewhere between 400 and 500 ppm. We want to make sure the room that's going to be measured is occupied with normal occupants and use patterns. So we want to make sure the kids are there like they are normally during the day, and that there's no non-human sources. We want to put the sensor as close to the middle of the room as possible. It's really just important that we're not sticking it right next to a wall or a cabinet or something like that. And then we want to log the data for a full day. And we also need to acknowledge that ventilation rates are going to change depending on the windows openings, the season, the weather, the thermal loads, and the HVAC operation. So we need to repeat this measurement on a regular schedule. This is really important now as many school districts are switching from cooling mode to heating mode, and the ventilation systems are going to be changing during that transition. So carbon dioxide concentrations are going to build up in the classroom over time when the students are present and drop when they're absent. This is why you can't just take one measurement point during the day. Rather, you need to log the data for the entire day. In this example case, you can see when the kids entered the room, excuse me, went out for recess, and the peak concentration. If you were to take a single point measurement, you would get readings that range from 400 to 1200 ppm. So what we really want to do is the data that's interest here is the highest average concentration over approximately 15 minutes. So in this case, about 1200 ppm or about 800 ppm above the outside concentration. And to give you a sense from this data came from a portable classroom that was at 2100 ppm before the teacher was given a CO2 monitor. Once they got that monitor, they actively opened the windows and the doors to reduce the CO2 concentration. And since this graph, they've actually installed an exhaust fan to lower the concentrations even farther. So how do we use this maximum CO2 concentration to get an idea of what the ventilation rate is? So what we can do is we can model what the CO2 concentration should be under ideal typical situation, typical use for the classroom. And so to do this, we need to know the volume of the space. We need to know the design ventilation rate for the space. And we need to know the numbers, the sex, the age, and the average weight and activity level of the students and teachers in the classroom. The activity level, or what's called the MET rate, is a description of how many people are in the room and how the people in the room are moving and how much energy they're using. And that correlates strongly with the amount of CO2 that they're emitting. And this MET level can vary a lot, leading to a lot of uncertainties in this model. There's some other assumptions in this model, including the steady state assumption for the occupation and ventilation rate. And while this isn't great for all spaces, the assumption is pretty good in classroom activities where the number of kids are present and they actually are fairly constant in their activity levels. Even if the space doesn't ever reach a steady state because the kids leave the room or the room is poorly ventilated, the high maximum concentration values can still indicate that the classroom has a problem. Another issue is the model assumes that all the air entering is from the spaces from the outside, like hallways or adjoining classrooms. And while this is true for portable classrooms, it's not necessarily true in a school building and where you have rooms with air influence from adjoining rooms and hallways. So this may lead to under or over prediction of the CO2 concentrations in the classrooms. So we can actually go and model this for any classroom that we're interested in. So NIST has a web-based tool that allows us, the user, to determine what the CO2 concentration should be in a range of different school densities and activity scenarios if the room is operating as it was designed. So in this case, we can enter up to 2 different ventilation rates, and we can also enter the number of occupants, what their average masses are, their ages, and their activity levels. And you can look up references on what relative activity levels are in classrooms, but it's usually 1 to 3. So what the model will do is it'll output a CO2 concentration that will increase with time, and then it'll reach some maximum concentration value. And the model will report those maximum concentration values that you can actually use as compared to what the actual concentration is in the classroom of interest. It's important to note that currently the model is reporting in units of milligrams per meter cubed, which is the SI unit, and not as ppm, which most consumer-based CO2 monitors reveal. And hopefully in the coming months, we'll update this to allow this to be a toggle so that you can change the output units. So on this graph, we can see how the CO2 concentration is a function of the ventilation rate. For all class cases for this class size, the students' activity levels were held constant. So the only variation here is the ventilation rate. And we can see at high ventilation rates greater than the ASHRAE requirement, as shown in this black line in the middle. This would be if this was ventilated at the ASHRAE requirement. The maximum CO2 concentration is reached relatively quickly in these first 2 hours at these high ventilation rates. And low ventilation rates, the concentration will continue to rise all day, reaching concentrations that may be up to 3 times higher than the ASHRAE guideline at this MET level. We can use the graph to see that if this classroom hit 1250 ppm after the first 2 hours, it will likely not be meeting ASHRAE ventilation rates for this specific classroom. And it's important to remember those ventilation rates were developed without a focus on airborne pandemic transmission. So these are pre-pandemic values. Likewise, if the CO2 concentration is still rising after 3 hours, we can be of uninterrupted occupation, we can be pretty sure that it's also not meeting the pre-pandemic ventilation rates, as higher ventilation rates would have already reached a stable concentration after 3 hours. Here's an example of a real classroom where the CO2 concentration is still rising after 3 hours of uninterrupted occupation, despite having only a maximum concentration of 1600 ppm. It's likely that this room is not meeting the pre-pandemic ASHRAE ventilation rates. However, if the concentration is at 800 ppm after 4 hours of continuous occupation, we could be pretty confident that it is meeting pre-pandemic ASHRAE pre-pandemic ventilation rates. So we can summarize the relationship between the ventilation rates and the maximum steady state concentration in the classroom with this chart. This chart is specific for 34 14-year-old students in a 100-meter square classroom. The purple line shows the potential maximum CO2 concentration when the students and teacher have minimal activity, low MET values. The green line shows the same potential maximum concentration when the student and teacher have higher MET activity levels. And you can notice if the room was operated at the required ASHRAE concentration, ASHRAE ventilation rate for this age group of 6.7 liters per second per person, the maximum CO2 concentration would be anywhere between 800 and 1250 ppm, depending only on the activity level of the occupants. We can do the same analysis for a classroom of 24 7-year-old students in a 100-meter square classroom. In this case, if the room was operated at the ASHRAE recommended requirement of 7.4 liters per second per person, the maximum CO2 concentration would be anywhere from 685 to 950 ppm, depending on the activity level of the students. If we overlay these two rooms, we can get a sense of the uncertainty in the model due to the activity level, the age, number of students. Despite the uncertainty, the high maximum daily CO2 concentrations are indicative of low outdoor air ventilation rates. If the maximum daily CO2 concentrations are below 700 ppm, we can be fairly confident that the ventilation rates are high, especially if the readings are repeated over multiple days. If the maximum CO2 readings are above 2000 ppm, we can be fairly confident that the ventilation rates are low and the room's ventilation system should be immediately expected or addressed. In classrooms in the middle, the concentrations in the middle is where we're going to have trouble. It's the range of values that gives less conclusive information on the state of the ventilation, as the model assumptions, the age, the weight, the size, activity, the steady state will all impact the conclusions we can draw for this form of data. But this does give us a tool that if we're above 2000 ppm in a classroom, that's the type of classroom that we're trying to find so that we can address them. We can see here that the role of differing ages and density has on modeled CO2 concentrations. An ideal classroom meeting ASHRAE ventilation rates will require, for 24 5 to 8-year-olds, will have a peak steady state concentration of about 1000 ppm, while a room of 34 greater than 9-year-olds will hit about 1300 ppm. However, to reiterate, both of these values are lower than most of the real world classrooms that have been measured in California studies in pre-pandemic times, indicating that classrooms prior to the pandemic were underventilated compared to ASHRAE requirements. Since the pandemic, several organizations have suggested roughly doubling the effective ventilation rates from 15 all the way to 15 liters per second per person resulting in CO2 concentrations that are about 400 or 500 ppm above the outside concentration. In other words, about 900 ppm. Or the organizations have recommended effective air change rates of 5 to 6 per hour, which we'll talk about in a second. Here's an example of using a CO2 monitor to demonstrate a poorly ventilated classroom. After collecting several days of similar data, it was discovered that this school had 2 faulty air handlers. The moral of the story is that if we have CO2 concentrations that are above 2000 to 5000 ppm, we need to take immediate steps to remedy the situation, as these are going to be potentially high-risk classrooms for COVID transmission. These steps include checking HVAC equipment, evaluating that the room is being used as it was designed from both a density and activity level from a ventilation perspective. And we need to ensure that there's no other CO2 sources that could be complicating our analysis. And while these steps should be taken immediately for classrooms with really high concentrations, they should also be done on a regular basis in all classrooms. And we'll quickly talk about the last way we can use CO2 concentrations to evaluate ventilation. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to raise the CO2 concentration either with students in the room, dry ice, soda stream canisters, or some other means, and then let the CO2 concentration decay with no people present or CO2 sources present. And this approach has been used for almost a century and is highlighted in ASTM E741. In this case, we can look at that same room and we can look at the air associated with at the end of the day. I know that the first big drop occurred when the students left the room in the afternoon, went to an afternoon recess with the windows and door open. The second decay occurred when all the doors and windows were closed after hours. This classroom was operated pre-pandemic with the doors and windows closed. We can do some fun math to keep track of the CO2 molecules in what's called a mass balance approach. This is much like standing in the front of a store and determining the number of people in the store by counting how many enter and leave the store rather than running around and constantly counting who's actually in the store. Once we've solved this math balance, this fun math on the left hand of the slide, we can solve for the CO2 decay rate. This is the rate at which the CO2 concentration is reduced. And we can plot this logarithmic expression versus time since we had that peak concentration and actually calculate the air change rate when nobody's present in the room. And in this case, it was 2 per hour. There's lots of uncertainties with this approach, including curve fit errors. The decay rate will again depend on ventilation, the weather, especially if it's a naturally ventilation with windows open. And like the previous method, the maximum concentration approach, this method assumes all the air entering the space comes from outside rather than hallways or classrooms. So this is actually a really good method for portable classrooms, but it has limitations in buildings. But you can still use the CO2 decay rate from a building as an estimate of the air change rate, especially in portable classrooms, such as we show here. The decay rate with the windows open was 1 per hour. When the room was shut, it lowered all the way down to 0.2 per hour, which is extremely low. For this portable classroom, these CO2 decay rates are reasonable approximations of the air change rate, as all the air again is entering from the outside. The classroom in this case was supplemented with 3 portable air filters, each with roughly about 1.5 per hour effective air change rates on maximum setting and an occasional window exhaust fan. So given the assumptions cited above, the CO2 decay rate was only an estimate of the air change rate for classrooms in connected buildings. And so remember, I'm talking about ventilation in this talk, but ventilation is only one part of the equation to mitigate this long-range transmission of COVID-19 in classrooms. Portable and central air handling filtration also play an important role and do not impact the CO2 concentration. So the 5 to 6 effective air change recommendations that are being made include all particle removal processes: ventilation, portable air filtration, and HVAC filtration. And so we need to add the effects of all of these processes together to determine what many people refer to as an effective air change rate for particles. So once you have the values for ventilation, the portable air filtration clean air delivery rate, and HVAC filtration, typically MERV 13 or higher, you can apply the appropriate conversions shown here to get them in the same equivalent air change units, and then we can add those together. The ventilation rate is often reported in liters per second per person, or CFM per person. The clean air delivery rate is only reported as the maximum setting, and you must lower it if you're not using it on the maximum setting. Usually the second setting is almost half of the first set of the highest setting for the clean air delivery rate. And for some configurations, the HVAC flows into a room. You can actually measure that flow using a bolometer, but not all configurations. And this method assumes that the particles are too small to significantly decay in indoor surfaces in a relevant time frame. Finally, I don't want to forget buses. Although the duration can be short, CO2 concentration in buses can rapidly rise. One school district has implemented the following based on this paper cited on the left. At minimum, fully open the front two windows and the second to last two windows. Avoid opening the last windows, as that can lead to exhaust concerns in the vehicle and concerns about exhaust entering the vehicle. So the bottom line is that CO2 concentrations in classrooms vary. The measurements should be repeated as season and HVAC operations change. Measurements provide actionable data that the school districts and teachers can use to help minimize long-range COVID transmission risk. High values should immediately cause remedial actions with building operators. Low values don't guarantee that space is safe, and we need to continue to monitor and inspect our classrooms. Open access to the CO2 data can build trust between the school community and the building operators that the school district is doing what they say they're doing, and keeping kids safe and schools open. And the open data allows the community to target resources to the rooms and schools that are problematic, rather than wasting money on schools that aren't. So finally, classrooms with higher ventilation rates have demonstrated decreased student absenteeism and increased student performance. So if we increase ventilation rate for COVID-19 reasons, we can also have long-term benefits for both students and teachers. With that, I will turn it over to Jim. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dustin, for that presentation. And I'm passing it off to Jim. He's going to go ahead and pull his slides up now. In the meantime, we're getting lots of questions. Thanks so much for putting in your questions in the Q&A. And we will be with you shortly. Jim is pulling them up as we speak.
Okay. Yes. All right, are we up? Can everybody hear me okay?
Beautiful.
Okay. So I'm going to talk on filtration and air cleaners for schools, and give you some idea of things that can be done and practical ways that we can reduce the effects of SARS CoV-2. Well, okay, here's some of the things we think we know about SARS. It's an unattached virus, or as an unattached virus, approximately 0.12 microns, 120 nanometers. Since it's a virus, it doesn't live on its own. So the target particle size is somewhere around 0.5 to 3 microns. And these particles stay airborne for hours. They do not, gravity does not pull them out of the air very quickly. They are in the air. Once they're created, they're going to be there for a long period of time. And what they lack in size, they make up for in numbers. 99% of the particles are less than 1 micron in size, or actually 2.5 microns in size. And as Dr. Prather mentioned, things like breathing, talking, laughing, singing, all create SARS-CoV-2 particles. I'm going to do a little bit different approach to how you look at the way you need to deal with a space. And look at the three things here. You want to distribute the particles, you want to dilute the particles, and remove the particles. That's the objective. Those particles that are emitted by the person who has the disease are going to be in the room. So the concentrate, you want to dilute it, distribute it, and remove it. Here are the current recommendations for COVID. First of all, you want to provide at least the minimum outdoor ventilation. And that means that you want to cut off any of the things that will shut down your HVAC system. Keep the air moving. You want to make sure that you're distributing and diluting. MERV 13 filters are higher for recirculated air. It's an important point, and we'll show why in just a minute. The goal is 6 air changes an hour, and that's going to distribute and dilute the particles in the room. And then if it's less than that, use air cleaners to supplement the HVAC systems. So why MERV 13? This was a study done by Dr. Brent Stevens, and it was used, the Wells-Riley equation was used to try to determine what would be the best level of filtration to deal with the virus. And as you can see, the bottom of that line, MERV 13 is where we need to be at that level. Here's another way to look at it. This is efficiency on particles, MERV 13 filters, efficiency on particles 1 to 3 microns and 0.3 to 1 micron. You'll see on the left that 90% of the particles will be picked out by a MERV 13 filter. So for our target particle size, we are right on the money of where we need to be in terms of efficiency. And even in 0.3 to 1 micron, we're at 61%. Oh, okay, so here's one of my pet peeves. Read an article in the newspaper and they say a HEPA filter is efficient, 99.97% efficient down to 0.3 microns. And then they say that, but the virus is 0.12 microns, so it won't pick up the virus. All filters, remember this one, all filters become more efficient and lower particle sizes. And you'll see here that there are filters from MERV 6 to MERV 16, all of them become more efficient on smaller particle sizes. So a HEPA filter is actually more efficient on 0.12 micron size particles, even though there aren't any that exist in terms of the virus, but still, that's something that you have to remember. Air filters become more efficient on both larger size particles and smaller size particles. Okay, here's some factors to consider in schools going to MERV 13 filters. First of all, the cost. They are more expensive, but right now, MERV 13 filters, the cost is stable. Then you have to look at the true cost, and it's filters versus risk. And I would argue that you have a relatively low true cost when you're buying a MERV 13 filter. Then it has to be compatible with equipment. There is slightly more resistance from MERV 13 filters. So older HVAC systems are not going to run as effectively when you put in a MERV 13 filter. So the systems need to be analyzed to make sure that they can withstand the increased resistance of a MERV 13 filter. So some districts have gone to MERV 11, and that is actually a good thing. We prefer MERV 13. The data shows that that's the best filter to remove the target particle sizes that we're looking at. But a MERV 11 filter, if that's the most that the equipment can stand, that's an excellent alternative. So let's look at, instead of filtration efficiency, let's look at filter effectiveness. I see very little about this in the articles that are written about filters. They're talking about just the efficiency of the filter. They're not talking about the 3 F's, as I call it. Filtration, that's the filter. Fit, that is how the filter fits into the system. And flow. Now, we just talked about filtration. Let's look at fit. If a filter is not installed properly, you have a dramatic decrease in effectiveness. Good study done by Dr. Jeffrey Siegel showing that a MERV 14 filter installed in a system with just a 1/2 inch gap becomes a MERV 8 filter. So it's extremely important that you have good fit. And anybody who's involved in schools or any kind of a building, one thing you can do today is make sure that the fit is good on all of the filters that are in your systems. And the final thing is flow. If the air doesn't flow through the system, it's not going to work. Many systems work somewhere around 30% of the time because they shut off with differences in temperature. And we would recommend that during this time, you keep the systems running so that you have flow through the system. We'll give you an example of the effect of flow a little bit later, but it's critical. Looking at filter effectiveness, how effective is the system, the filtration system, on pulling particles out of the air? That's what we want to look at. Filtration, fit, and flow. What about recirculation? When all the data started coming out, all the recommendations started coming out on COVID, we were trying to totally avoid recirculation. And what we were finding is that even though there are cases where we have found RNA on the ductwork, on the filters, and even on the supply registers, we have not found any cases where the disease has been transmitted through an HVAC system. Now, there is a case in China where they say it's central AC that actually used a split system, very poor filtration, and it's not a ducted system like I'm talking about. So most of the stuff in the United States are ducted systems, and we're not really seeing problems with recirculation. And as Dr. Bill Bonfles says, you still need to have a MERV 13 filter to make sure that's happening. The goal is to obtain 6 air changes an hour. As was discussed earlier, you need to calculate the natural ventilation, the mechanical ventilation, what extra benefit that you're getting from the filtration, and then look at how to make up the difference with supplemental air cleaners like a HEPA or a do-it-yourself. Here are some examples of HEPA air cleaners. There are many out there. They vary in terms of quality and effectiveness. It's too much data to go through all of this, but Dr. Marwa Zatari has put together a really well done summary of the effectiveness of many different air cleaners. She's got based on the CADR, or clean air delivery rate, the noise that the air cleaner makes, as well as the price, the cost per CFM. And as Dr. Prather said, we would think it's better to avoid additive products that claim to alter indoor air. So there just aren't any good peer-reviewed studies showing that these things work. In fact, there are a number of studies showing that they don't work, particularly ozone, hydroxyl radicals, hydrogen peroxide, bipolar ionization. Still don't have good studies on that. Cold plasma. And in the Q&A, if you want to ask me about the study that I did almost 20 years ago on the ionic breeze and what happens when it's in an environment where you have terpenes, I'd be glad to give you the story on that. It's a really good story. So we have HEPA air purifiers to supplement, and then I'll tell you about a phone call I got August 6, 2020. Was from Wired magazine, and the reporter said, "Do you know about putting air filters on box fans. I said, I think it works. I'm pretty sure it works. I've never done it before, but I'll tell you what, I'll go out and buy some filters and put them on some box fans and I'll see what happens. So what comes out is an article, and the article is entitled, "Could a janky jury-rigged air purifier help fight COVID-19? Indoor experts think, sure, maybe, why the hell not? We convinced the CEO of an air filter company to give it a try." Well, that was me. I was the CEO. And this is the bottom is the article that I wrote in addition to the Wired article. And in the article in Wired, Dr. Richard Corsi, a longtime friend from at that time at the University of Texas, just made an offhand comment. And he said, what would happen if you made a box with 3 or 4 sides made out of filters, and that would reduce the pressure drop and still move a lot of air? What do you think would happen? Well, that was my incentive to find out what would happen, and I made the first, what is now called the Corsi-Rosenthal box. I named it after Dr. Corsi, and he said, "You made it. You need to have your name on it as well." So it became the Corsi-Rosenthal box. And it's a low cost, do it yourself, easy to assemble, and effective air cleaner. And as Dr. Prather mentioned, was just on the CBS Evening News last night. It was a short but very good program showing how effective it was in a setup at University of California, San Diego. Okay, so here are the basics. It's very easy to find the supplies. There's 4 or 5 MERV 13 filters, box fan and tape. It's inexpensive, costs less than $100 to build. And here's what I like to say. If you can seal a box, you can make a Corsi-Rosenthal box air cleaner. And I think most of us can seal a box and send it by UPS. We can do this. It's powerful. Runs at 580 feet per minute at 24 inches from the fan. It's efficient. The efficiency that I'm getting out of the box is pretty similar to the efficiency that you would have through an ASHRAE 52.2 test. It's safe. Underwriters Laboratories has studied it, found it was in all limits for safety, and that study was just put out by the EPA. It's on their website now, so you're welcome to look at that. Again, it's all within all limits of safety. And I know there are concerns about the heat that might be created. I've done a lot of studies looking at heat with the ones that I run. In fact, the first one that was ever made is sitting 6 feet away from my desk as I'm talking now. It's quiet. It runs at 51 decibels at its lowest speed. And it's also scalable. And this is really important. Can you make enough of them to make a difference? And this is a school in Rochester. They made 18 of them last year, and they used them all year. They had no cases of COVID in the school, and worked out really well. They just changed the filters just about a month ago with school opening again. It was a really good example of how it can work in a school environment. Dr. Shelley Miller from the University of Colorado had one of her students do a little test on it, and she found that it reduced PM 2.5 by 92%. This little box fan on a box of filters. So I'll give you a little quiz here. We're going to have a battle of the air cleaners. In this corner, we have contestant number 1. This is an IQ Air HEPA air purifier. It's around $1,000. And over in this corner, we have a Corsi-Rosenthal box. This doesn't have MERV 13 filters on it. It has MERV 11 filters. We're going to have a side-by-side comparison of the $1,000 HEPA air cleaner versus the Corsi-Rosenthal box with MERV 11 filters. Guess what happens? It's the airflow. It's like I was talking about earlier. In order to have filter effectiveness, you have to have the filter, you have to have the fit, and you have to have the flow. And because the flow of the Corsi-Rosenthal box was substantially higher than the flow of the HEPA air cleaner, even on a high speed, all the dips, all the areas where you have the lowest particle counts are where we're running a MERV 11 filters on a Corsi-Rosenthal box. So what's happened since then? I mean, the really fun thing for me, this is an open source deal. This is nobody's making money on this. It was originally thought of, and everybody has agreed all the way in. This is for everybody. This is not just a me or a Dr. Corsi or anybody. And that's what's been so fun about this, is that so many people have participated in studying it, making it available. And bottom line, it works. And the best part about it is we're not helpless. We can do something during this pandemic. This is a study that was done at the University of California, Davis. They tested all kinds of different variations, 4 filter, 1 filter, just a really nice study. But then what they also did was they took that information and they put together an indoor air class for junior high school students. And this was a 2-day class on indoor air quality. And the class concluded by building 30 Corsi-Rosenthal boxes for their school. What a great way to teach about indoor air quality. Illinois Institute of Technology, their built environment group, did a CADR test, and CADR again stands for Clean Air Delivery Rate. It is a prescribed test method that measures smoke, the removal of smoke, dust, and pollen. And as you see here, the CADR for smoke in this test was 166 CFM. For dust, it's 321 CFM, and for pollen, it's 464. Now, if you look at the dust, 320 CFM, and look at the particle size, 0.3 to 3 microns. That seems to be exactly the target particle size that we're looking for. So I think CADR for dust is probably the best measurement for us. And as I mentioned, the thrill of this is the fact that so many people have become involved in it. This is a website, cleanaircrew.org, and a lot of this website is dedicated to providing first-class information about these do-it-yourself box fan filters. And the collage of all the people that have made these and put them out on Twitter, and we've commented on them. It's just been a joy to see all this stuff happening. Dr. Josh Apte at University of California, Berkeley. I love this quote. Every air quality researcher I know has played around with these because they are so satisfying and simple and fun, and they work. And here is some of the results of the study that he did in a classroom. So they don't stop there. The UC Berkeley, they decided to make 140 of these for 6th grade classrooms as part of their outreach project at the University of California, Berkeley. So this is some pictures that people bringing in the box fans, and some of them that have already been built. It was a great outreach project. And then here's my favorite. Dr. Prather was involved in creating this. This is at UC San Diego. They built 250 Corsi-Rosenthal boxes. They used really good filters. They used Texair filters. But it was a very successful bill. This was what was on the CBS Evening News, and the speed up building of the boxes is one of the great scenes, I think, of this whole this whole episode so far. So these are, again, they're inexpensive, they're highly effective, very easy to make. One of the best videos that was done on making a Corsi Rosenthal box was done by a fourth grader in Hawaii. It's just fantastic, and I will put that out there so that you can have a chance to look at that as well. And finally, that's what I like to say. It works, and we are not helpless. And thank you. I'll be available for questions.
Great, thank you so much. I'll pass this on to Karen, and we'll have you guys come in. We've got a lot of questions to get through here.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to start off with some questions about masks and Delta. Do any of you know about school districts that are addressing mask quality and fit? Where I am, some masks are not fitting well, or a single layer cloth, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I can comment on that. I pushed to improve masks because we at UC San Diego at K through 12, I think there's still what they're trying to do is encourage people to wear better fitting masks. But we have been, we're handing out KN95s as for people who aren't wearing good enough masks. But at K through 12, I'm not aware, unfortunately. And I think that they should. I think that the mask, what you're wearing, at a minimum, I showed, tricky ways you can make a surgical mask work better. You can even add a brace, which I didn't talk too much about. It's on the CDC website. I'm a big believer that the most important thing you can do is the very first step, which is to wear a mask and not ever let it get in the air in the first place. And especially with kids, they're skewed, they're sideways, they're gaps. It's a really good idea, but unfortunately, I'm not sure. I think they're just happy that the kids are wearing masks at all. So, which is important. It's better to have some mask than no mask. I should add that.
Great. And you also mentioned masks outdoors. You mentioned that outdoor transmission of the Delta variant is occurring more frequently. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, the evidence for that comes from Australia. They call it, I remembered now, the word was fleeting exposures, which at first I thought was a little crazy, but it's become, these quote unquote fleeting exposures have become more common, and they picked it up in Australia, which is amazing because their cases are so low, and I guess they have cameras everywhere. And so they could actually track who got it and how close they came to the infected individual. And they've shown that just passing by, if you think about it, if you were to pass, there aren't, most people honestly don't spread, they're at a point where they can be sick, but not spreading it. But there's these, what we call super spreaders that release massive quantities, usually before they get symptoms, if they get symptoms. And if you step back and think about the CDC's guidance, it says 15 minutes. That was before Delta. And so once Delta came along, there's a point, very short point, where you can actually spread a lot more with Delta, up to 1,000 times more. That 15 minutes, then you're exposed to the same amount of virus with alpha. With Delta, that comes down to 1 second. So again, it's not very frequent. You don't know who it is. It's like playing Russian roulette. Most people won't do that. So I don't want to panic people, but it is possible.
Yeah, a follow-up question is actually what you just referred to. Can you explain the difference between saying that Delta is 2 times as transmissible versus 1,000 times viral load? What's the difference?
There's just so much that goes into, so I was focusing on total viral load that you inhale. I wasn't talking about 1,000 times more transmissible. That'd be terrible. So that's a really good distinction. So bottom line is transmissibility, basically how transmissible it is factors in how much you need to be infected. It factors in your immune system. It factors in, how you're exposed. There's just a whole bunch of factors that go into how much more transmissible. And then when you factor all that in, it comes down to, I think, there's different range of numbers, but yeah, it's about 2 times more.
Great. And one last question about just the virus itself. What difference do temperature and humidity make on aerosol infectivity indoors?
Dustin, do you want to do that one?
I'm not an expert, but I know that increased humidity decreases the
lifetime.
The lifetime. Decreases the lifetime. On top of my head, I can't remember temperature effects. I don't think they're quite as dominant but I don't recall.
Yeah, there's a range. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I figured because the indoor stuff is your, I
just don't remember off the top of my head. Lindsay Marr has papers on it.
Yeah, Lindsay Marr is the one that sort of has studied this and shows there's kind of this sweet spot in the middle that it really likes. And you want it either higher humidity, which would make the droplets not shrink as fast, so they'll fall to the ground more quickly, or you want low. And so it's kind of like there's a sweet spot, and temperature plays a role in also how fast it evaporates, also plays a role in how long it remains infectious. So there's, all these factors. And as I say, Lindsay has studied it a lot for influenza, but we still we're assuming it's similar, but there's still a lot more work to be done for this virus.
Great. Okay, I'm going to move on to some monitoring in classrooms and schools. We had one question about, Dr. Prather, you showed the purple air monitor, which is a more monitor for PM 2.5. Can you talk about why you use that in conjunction with the CO2?
Yeah, sure. It's a little confusing. So CO2 is the one that is by far the most common, because that is what you try to do is was described as you're trying to get your CO2 levels to be just like outdoors. So it just makes indoors as safe as outdoors in theory, right? So that's what CO2 tells you. It tells you about the ventilation and how, quote, fresh your air is. But particles, aerosols, which is where the virus resides, doesn't behave. It behaves differently than CO2. If you were to, and it can be really patchy. And so in a room, it's so different. And so again, if you have fresher air, you're going to usually dilute the particles. So we can assume they're lower. But if you really wanted to be careful and really know, which is what we did, you can also add aerosol measurements, particle counters. And so these purple air sensors are super simple. We just moved them from classroom to classroom. So not every classroom has it, but we just checked. And so they will tell you how good your HEPA filtration and your MERV filtration are. That's what you're removing with the filters. And so you can run those and just watch your particle concentrations go low. The idea being that the lower the aerosols are, the less you're inhaling, the less, you're lowering risk. And so they directly measure the aerosols. So
yeah, one comment on that, they don't necessarily measure the size range that the virus is at. There's a cutoff above the size range where the virus is at, but they're also really effective for places that have poor outdoor air quality. For instance, if you have fire season and you have really significant outdoor issues, you don't want to be having high rates of ventilation in those cases. You want to be doing it as much as you can with filtration. So it can serve as a warning if you have a spike that we should be shutting down our outdoor ventilation, and we should be worried more about our filtration in those cases, because in those cases, there may be more risk from bringing in highly contaminated outdoor air.
Okay, yeah, that's important.
And quickly, the filtration, sometimes people have their HEPA filters on and they look at their CO2 devices and say, uh-oh, my CO2 is not changing or whatever. The filtration removes the aerosols. It will not affect the CO2 levels. So that's where it gets a little confusing. So we're remembering all these details, but yeah, it's a little tricky, but yeah, they each were measuring different things.
Got it. We had someone ask about sending a CO2 monitor with their child to school that they wear throughout the day. Is that a good idea? And have you had experience with that?
Yes, that. So there's a couple things here. One is, in general, if you put it in an outside pocket of a backpack, it will give a reasonable approximation of the CO2 concentration in the environment that the person is in. It may be off by a few ppm, it may be a little bit lagged, but it's not significant compared to the overall max. If a kid came home with a value that was in 3,000, that room is going to be plus or minus 100. So yes, you can get values by doing that. The other aspect, you can get reasonable representations of what the kid was experiencing. The other aspect of this is, I will say, social / political / educational. And what do you do with that data? How do you engage the school to actually do something? Do you tell them prior? Do you tell them after if you have a problem? Yeah, we've had experience with this, and it's pretty much, schools are not happy when they see high numbers. They would rather, if they don't have the data, then they don't have a problem. But if you have data that shows a problem, you have to be very careful on how you address and how you get it. And some school districts can initially be, we've got this, don't worry about it. But then when they see the data, they'll actually do something and do an investigation and find a problem. So it's a very, from a scientific perspective, there's no problems with doing it. It's all political and how you use that data to the best possible means.
Yeah,
I think the critical point is data. When you look at any of these things, having more data, it makes it much easier to make decisions. And like, I like to carry my CO2 meter on an airplane flight, and gives you an idea of what's like in the waiting area by the gate, going down the ramp on the airplane during the boarding. And the airlines are making decisions about when they use the air conditioning or heating from the airport, or when they turn on their HEPA filters. And the more data they have, I think it's better for them to make better decisions.
yeah. We did have, Dustin, a couple of questions about, can you just give a good rule of thumb for CO2 levels? Excellent, good, okay, not acceptable.
You're muted, Dustin.
Thank you. I will give two, and those are the two that I highlighted in the talk. And that, if you're below 800, if you're below 800 ppm, you probably have at minimum ASHRAE required ventilation in your classroom. And these are numbers for classrooms. These are not numbers for restaurants or anything else. If you're above 2,000, something is wrong. You are not even at ASHRAE ventilation guidance. You can have scenarios in between that 800 to 2,000 that theoretically you could be at those levels. Now, all that being said, those levels are determined from pre-pandemic non-airborne transmission risk ventilation rates. So even if you're at those numbers, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be safe.
So what would
be safer?
So what would be a good level in the time that we?
So kind of my big picture guidance is, if you're at 2,000, you need an immediate action. You need a remediation ASAP. Something is wrong with the ventilation system. It's not being operated or designed at what it should be, given the ASHRAE requirements. If you're somewhere between 1,200 and 2,000, you better make sure that you've got really good filtration and portable filtration, a MERV 13 filter. All those things should be in place, and they should be operating correctly. And then you should also go back and double check your ventilation, but it's not like something that, if it happens next week as opposed to tomorrow, it's probably okay, or next month. You want it happening soon. If you're at 800, pat yourself on the back and measure it again tomorrow, because it might change.
Okay, and great.
Can I add real quick? Make sure you make the measurement while everybody's present. Some schools are going in and doing it when nobody's there, and it's always good. So just
yes. Those numbers I gave are for occupied classrooms at standard occupancy,
Okay.
not with just one person there, not with nobody there. We've had our local school district measured classrooms with nobody there. And that data really isn't useful. It doesn't tell you anything because there's no sources of CO2. So you're not measuring anything that's relevant.
Yes. Okay. Great. We had some question now about filters. Somebody asked a question about these portable air cleaners, whether or not it's the Corsi Rosenthal box or other ones that schools might have. What can you explain about, if you're downwind from, the source of exposure and the air cleaner, and how does that work with transmission?
So in the big picture in a classroom, we always have air moving. It doesn't matter if we have a filter box there or not. Air is moving. It'll move across the classroom in roughly 5 minutes if it moves in a linear fashion, which it doesn't, but it is well mixed within the order of time frame that we're in a class. All the studies I've reviewed on jets and plumes show that those jets and plumes will dissipate within a few feet of either the person who's emitting them or when they're coming towards the intake of a filter. And so as long as we're not having people with sitting really close to each other or sitting really close to the filter, we're probably not going to have anything worse than what was already existing in the classroom prior. And if we have these portable units in the classroom, we have the added benefit that we're reducing the overall concentration during that time frame. And so we aren't having major impact on the short range transmission by putting these in the classrooms, but we have a really big benefit on reducing the potential for long range aerosol transmission. And so the key here is just make sure you're not putting a kid right next to the filter all day, and you're probably going to be fine.
Goes back to distribute, dilute, and remove, and also by having these filtration devices going up, they really distribute and mix the air within the space very effectively. So that's what you want. Again, the particles that are emitted by the person with the disease, they're not going to go away unless they're removed. And so you want to make sure that you're distributing them. And just go back to distribute, dilute, and remove.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, because this is so there's one study that has messed all this up. The other thing, I don't know if it was made super clear, Jim just said it, but I'm going to say it to make sure. People are worried about some of these filters, they're, blowing it out the side at people. Whereas the Corsi box, the one that I have sitting right here, yes, I do, Corsi Rosenthal box, the fan points up. So it's pushing, it's sucking in the air from the sides away from people. It's pulling the air away from people and sending filtered air, more dilute air up, and it's mixing. So there is no harm, and that is a really important point to add, because that is the biggest quote kind of pushback that we get. The other one I'll just shortcut is sometimes people will say, oh, it's they overheat. No, the 4-sided box has plenty of flow. It doesn't put any strain. It's been made, people have measured the strain there is no strain, noticeable strain on the fan. So they basically there's no more danger than running a fan normally would have. And so I just want to point that out too. Those are the two most, and the trip hazard. So you stick a plate over the cords. Those have been the biggest kind of quote pushback. And also I just think school districts just don't believe that you could build something for $70 instead of buy something for $1,000 and it will work as well. I just don't think some people, it's too good to be true, but it's not.
Yeah.
And I think that there should be an emphasis on always using a new fan. And the reason that's important is that all these new fans have fuses on the plug. So if something were to happen, that's another thing that can help provide a level of safety.
Yeah, the EPA just released some research on safety in DIY air cleaners, and they said, new air cleaners 2012 or later, which is when that change was made. Okay, we had we're way over time, but I have one or two more questions. Is there a number of these Corsi Rosenthal boxes recommended per square foot?
Well, it goes back to the CADR, and let's just say that we're using dust as our CADR, so that would be whatever it was, 360, and that's with an 8-foot ceiling. That's probably a pretty good measure per square foot. So it'd be about a 360 square foot room. So I think most classrooms, you're probably better off with 2. And the 2 reasons for that: one is you're going to get much better coverage. The second one is that you can turn the volume down. I think the biggest issue that we're seeing is that many teachers are worried about their students not hearing them. They're wearing a mask already, and then they're not hearing them, and you want the volume down. But there's another part of it, and that's the training. We need to make sure that teachers understand what it's doing, why it's there, why it's important to run it. And so some of the resistance, I think, is we're just not doing a good job of training the teachers. We need to make sure they know why it's there. So.
Okay, great. Let's see. We had one quick question about plexiglass barriers, which you see a lot of places. Should we recommend to the school that they are taken down?
I'll answer that one. One of my favorite subjects. Plexiglass is a very bad barrier for aerosols. Any air movement at all will actually create negative pressure behind the barrier and create particles as an aerosols going directly into the breathing area of the person behind the plexiglass. There was a study of various mitigation measures, masks and filters and air cleaners and plexiglass. And guess what? The only one that had negative correlation that actually made things worse was plexiglass. So in my view, I just don't think they help, and they're cosmetic and just not that effective.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then, one last question. We had several people write about pushback from school administrators on filtration, masking, etc. Do you guys have any tips for how to engage school administrators in these mitigation measures?
Yeah, again, I would recommend going out to this cleanaircrew.org website. There's a lot of good information, draft letters that people could send. And I think at the end of the day, push is not going to work as well as pull. And so the more things that we do like this and the show on CBS Evening News and other things that show this is an effective, low-cost device without danger for anything, the more pull we're going to have instead of push. So I think that it's educational. We got to make sure people understand how it works, and then I think the resistance is going to go down. I've seen this over the last year and 4 months that the resistance has gone down substantially, and people are jumping on board and feeling like it's an alternative that can be successful.
And then one follow-up question to that, or I have seen in some of our work that schools are frankly tired about talking about COVID, and with vaccines and everything's coming, they want to move on. Are there any benefits to indoor air quality and some of the things that you guys are talking about in a non-COVID world, which hopefully we will get to at some point?
I'll jump on that one. I think that, yes, and that's what I've pushed. I've talked to Biden's task force, his equity task force. This is a big equity issue because a lot of people are, certain people are breathing the worst air, right? So this could clean up. This will help during wildfires. This will help with flu. Basically, it just keeps the air clean. It removes all pathogens, not just SARS CoV-2. And so I keep saying to people, especially the filtration, I'm just, putting those around. it just will, the benefits are going to go long beyond COVID. And, having we've just put up with poor indoor air quality our whole lives, right? It's crazy. We accept that every winter everybody's going to be sick. We don't have to live like this. And so it also helps with cognitive disorders, just again, lower levels of CO2 are going to help kids in school. So I think, to me, that this is the silver lining. Indoor air quality is now being recognized again. And I think the benefits are going to be tremendous. That it's worth the investment.
Yeah, I would just add, oh, go ahead, Jim.
Well, I think too that the more you reduce particles indoors, the better it's going to be for people with asthma and allergies. And it's one of my big things. I just think you owe it to people to try to make indoors as much of an oasis as possible when you have high outdoor pollen levels.
Yeah, and I just add that, I think that we can use this to identify our really poor performing indoor air quality schools and address them and fix them and hopefully address some of the inequalities that we have in our existing school structure from a health perspective of schools that are poorly ventilated or not removing particles. And we can see that if we do this, we have long-term benefits, as Tim was mentioning. We have test scores that go up, we have cognitive function that goes up, math and reading science scores all go up, respiratory symptoms go down, missed school days go down. If your school is funded by absenteeism, your funding actually goes up because you have more kids in class all the time. And so you have more parents that don't have to necessarily stay home with their kids because their kids aren't sick as much. So there's a lot of benefits for society if we focus on improving the indoor air quality of our classrooms. And I agree with Kim. I think this is the big silver lining of dealing with the pandemic in our schools. It's been one heck of a 20 months, but I think hopefully we can come out the other side, but actually benefiting our schools, especially the schools that have been neglected, and getting those schools to be better performing from both educational standpoint, but also an indoor air perspective.
I'd like to make one more point. The fatigue issue. I mean, we're all worn out. I mean, it's been a tough year and a half for all of us. And a school board has this thing. It's the processes that we're talking about. They're not easy. There are things that you have to do, and they're important. They're not easy. And that makes the school board or the school decision makers vulnerable to somebody walking in and saying, I'm going to put this thing in your HVAC, you're not going to have to do anything, and it's going to miraculously go out and get all the virus and knock it out of the air. And they think, whoa, that's a great idea. We can do that, not spend any money, or we'll spend money, but we'll get everything solved. And it's just that they're taking advantage of the people who are the decision makers that are worn out and vulnerable. And all I would say is, if you're involved in a decision in a school, make sure that you buy things that are scientifically proven and are going to give the best benefit to your students and teachers.
Well, thank you so much for all of your time and expertise today. This has been so helpful, and the recording will be going out to everyone who registered, and I'm sure that it will be watched hundreds and thousands of times. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you too for making this so accessible and for giving our audience the tools, science-based tools they can use to better protect our students and in the future past COVID. Thanks so much, Karen, too. We're approaching the end of today's webinar. A video recording will be available on SHEA's website soon, and tomorrow you'll receive an email containing a link to the video. SHEA's next partnership call will take place next Thursday, October 14th, and is titled Health Effects and Sources of Melamine Exposure. To learn more into RSVP, please visit our website at healthandenvironment.org. If you are new to SHEA and would like to stay updated about upcoming events or more, please sign up to receive a newsletter by selecting the Join Us tab at the top of any page on our website at healthandenvironment.org. Additionally, if you appreciate these SHEA partnership webinars bringing you the latest environmental health research for free, we encourage you to support SHEA's ongoing work by making a tax-deductible donation via our secure website. Again, our website is healthandenvironment.org. With that, I would like to thank our speakers, Kim, Dustin, and Jim. Thank you so much for taking time to present today. And to you, Karen, for your excellent moderation. Thank you so much. Stay well and healthy, and wish everyone a great day.